So it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend of around 15 years already, Dr. Minwoo Lee. Dr. Minwoo Lee is a postdoc researcher at Cornell University, and his research focuses on the neuroscience of prosociality with an emphasis on caregiving. And he completed his bachelor degree in psychology at Korea University. And then he completed the master in social and decision neuroscience lab under Dr. Hakjin Kim, where we spent our time together. And then he completed his PhD in anthropology in Emory University, which I believe made his academic perspective very unique because it can integrate psychology, neuroscience, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. And then he joined Cornell University as a postdoc researcher. And then now he's transitioning to his second postdoc position at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Minwoo Lee.
Thank you so much for kind introduction, Dr. Yoon. So can anybody hear my voice well? All right, sounds good. It's my great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this exciting opportunity. Welcome. I'm really excited to present my work at the Center for Vital Longevity. And it's always an exciting and it's a great pleasure to share my research and talk about it with those with a shared interest. So I'm really excited for today's opportunity. So I'm going to talk a lot about grandmaternal caregiving. And it's actually a two-part presentation. One, the first part focusing a little more on what's the neurocorrelates that predict different types of grandmaternal caregiving engagement. The second part being a little more about the intersection between grandmaternal caregiving or just in caregiving in general and what that speaks to healthy aging, which I think kind of suits the topic for this center. A lot of results that I'm going to present today are, let's say, exploratory and preliminary nature, but I still hope that by the end of the talk, we can still generate some interesting thought points and questions we can talk about together. So let's jump right into. As Dr. Yoon explained, I'm an equal part biological anthropologist and also social neuroscientist. I kind of like to approach the topic of human sociality from the angle of ecological perspective or evolutionary perspective. And I always want to explore that and through the angle of that. And grandmaternal caregiving kind of represents really, really interesting and potentially uniquely human aspects of sociality and is even among different types of prosocial behavior that we exhibit. So grandmaternal caregiving is let's say, an interesting manifestation of something biological anthropologist calls cooperative breeding. How many of you are familiar with this? Okay, so cooperative breeding refers to a social system where individuals other than biological parents, it's mostly mothers, in this case in mammalian species, still participate and contribute to raising offspring. And this sounds all familiar because we ourselves are cooperative breeders. And of course, we are not the only species that does cooperative breeding, or we are not even the primate species that does cooperative breeding as a major mode of childbearing, but we do represent rather extreme end of the spectrum. So when we compare ourselves into our closest evolutionary cousins, such as great apes or old world monkeys, we kind of stand out when we look into, let's say, just how many different types of individuals participate in some form of caregiving practices over time. And this makes it also really interesting because a lot of theories of evolutionary theory and neuroscientists believe that alloparenting forms some sort of a basis for a more complex form of uniquely human prosocial. So it gives us reason to think about, why is to give ourselves a reason to study it. And grandmothers are actually very important allo mothers, provide major caretakers across different society. Let it be industrialized society or maybe more traditional societies like a hunter-gatherer society. Grandmothers tend to involve themselves into a variety of caregiving tasks, including daily instrumental caregiving tasks, teaching, playing with them, and also just spending downtime with the caring, them, a wide variety of them. And the evidence has suggested rather consistently that the presence of supportive grandmother is beneficial is associated with positive developmental and life outcomes. So this is a very famous study that came out like a long time ago, but essentially what it captures is that with healthy and young grandmother, the mortality expected mortality of the grand offspring kind of goes down. And this is also data from a Finland and a Canadian population, as showing that if mothers live close by with their own maternal grandmother, they tend to have show increased fertility intention, and also they end up actually having kids compared to mothers who live far away from their own mothers. So it seems that grandmotherhood is associated with some sort of evolutionary advantage or adaptive significance. And it's also interesting when you think outside of human as a species, and grandmotherhood itself is just, oh, just disappeared? Oh no. Okay, but you saw the pictures. It's incredibly rare. So when you look into this entire mammalian taxa, we do know that it only exists approximately like 6 to 7 species, one being elephants and the other one being whales, and all the other species are some sort of subspecies within the category. So given the rarity of it and also the adaptive significance of like grandmotherhood, it has been suggested that maybe it represents a human adaptation that evolved to support inclusive fitness, which is basically you increase the likelihood of survival of your offspring, grand offspring who carry part of your gene. So it says that this postulation claims that it's a biological adaptation, potentially unique in human, especially in primate, because like we don't see any other in other primates, grandmother doesn't exist. So this specific theoretical notion has been debated, the validity of it. Not everyone believes that it's like biological adaptation, and like specific interpretation of the data tend to be different across different parties of people, but it still stands as one of the influential thoughts, and it kind of shows you that how important the idea of grandmotherhood has received attention from a relevant field of study. But what's relatively lagging behind is like notwithstanding its theoretical importance, we know surprisingly little about the proximate mechanisms that really support grandmaternal caregiving. What helped them, what motivated them to participate in different type of caregiving behavior, and is that similar or different from the neurobiological mechanisms that help parents engage in parenting behavior? We don't really know a lot of this, but what we generally have some evidence from psychological study that involve more in-depth interviews, or we do have an ethnographic record suggesting that females tend to report like a significance of or fulfilling nature of becoming a grandmother. So the idea is there, but what we don't know is that how that actually maps to the neurobiology of that. And this is where my first part of the research tries to kind of address a little bit. All right, so one possibility of that is that the information about the grandchildren may be encoded as highly rewarding and salient stimuli in the brain. And of course, caregiving and parenting behavior is a highly complex behavior, and it's not governed by a single functional circuitry, but I think that it makes sense to focus on something called parenting motivation circuits. This involves substructures in basal ganglia, hypothalamus, and also midbrain, such as nucleus accumbens, medial preoptic area, and tegmental area, substation niagara, and they are all exchange anatomical connection, and their activity, neurons in these regions are co-regulated. Say activities of neurons of these regions are co-regulated by common neuromodulators such as dopamine or oxytocin. So what makes this a more interesting candidate is that the same circuits is also found in the human as well. So evidence is usually coming from fMRI research showing that the activation or increased activation in this region correlate with parenting motivation, the degree to which individuals participate in daily caregiving, both in men and women. So it gives us a good region to look into, and it is possible that similar circuitry is involved and is activated participating in the caregiving engagement when grandmother brain detects some cues that signal, oh, that's my grandchildren. That's kind of the question that I'm trying to drill down to a little bit. There are different ways that brain may represent like information, and there are different techniques that we can use to look into. And we can do this different encoding pattern. I'm sure you are familiar with the fMRI method here. But one way that we can think about is that, okay, when grandmother sees the information about their own grandchildren, for example, like a photo of their face photo of their grandchildren, as opposed to the photos of other relevant social category, it may be that activities in this region may increase on average, and it is also possible that like it may form, like let's say the neural representation associated with own grandchildren, maybe something really distinct from the neural representation or special representation of the activation associated with other social category. So in this study, I want to examine both of this animal and try to link this back to individual differences in caregiving behavior measured in terms of social self-observing. So this kind of constitutes the hypothesis of this study. Hypothesis 1-1 and 1-2 is about essentially viewing photos of grandchildren when incur increased activation in parental motivation circuit or a distinct multiple cell activation activation pattern in the same region. The hypothesis 2 is that essentially trying to link either of this measure, univariate or multivariate neural signature of own grandchildren with different measures of care. Okay. So we did an fMRI study here. We recruited 50 grandmothers, healthy grandmothers. We ended up using 48 grandmothers data, and 19 of them were paternal grandmother. I'd like you to remember this information because we're going to come back to this point here. And we tried to get some in-depth or tap into the different dimensions of caregiving. So caregiving is a very complex construct as well. It involves many different behaviors and motivational state. So we try to use the self-report measures to tap into as wide a variety of the caregiving engagement form as possible. We also collected the health-related information that may interfere with our sample's ability, our participants' ability to engage in caregiving at all. We did conduct a structured interview, which is still the work in progress. We're still analyzing it. It's just so many of text data. I wish I could present it today, but maybe next time. And lastly, we invite all of our participants to the fMRI scanner room, and we collected their saliva sample, and we have them perform certain tasks inside the scanner. This is the schematic representation task. It's a rather simple face perception task where participants viewed a series of human faces that were coming from 4 different social categories and 1 control category. And these 4 social categories varied in terms of age and the familiarity/kinship relationship to participants themselves. So FP here represents familiar parent. That's mostly their own adult children or a focal child. And OGC is own grandchildren. Unfamiliar parent, unfamiliar grandchildren. They're all matched in terms of age, gender, and race. And we took this from some other photos submitted by other participants. And we focused on the parental motivation circuit as defined by the meta-analysis activation map, and we confirmed that it overlaps substantially with some of the key nodes of the parental motivation circuit, including nucleus accumbens, medial preoptic area, and substantia nigra. So this is just a recap of our approach. We decided to use both a univariate and multivariate approach. As for univariate approach, we extracted the unthresholded activation associated with each of these faces against implicit baseline, and we tried to analyze the effects of the different categories. By the way, this is not the actual data. This is just schematic representation of how it look like. And as for the multivariate approach, we used a representation similarity analysis where we directly calculate the correlation between different special patterns of activation associated with one social category with another. And we subtract that from 1, meaning that higher value, resulting value means that the neural representation of the 2 categories are distinct. Okay, and this, since we had 5 different categories, we have 5, 5, 5, something called this neural dissimilarity matrix. And with this data, we did a bunch of different analysis, part of which we're going to talk about. So essentially, we did some hierarchical clustering to figure out the representational structure of different social category. And also we did more quantitative based regression approach. So we built multiple different theoretical models that should capture different organizing principles that might bind this information together. And we tried to see which of this theoretical model best captured the actual empirical data that we extracted from the focal ROI. So for the time constraint, we're not going to go deep into this result here, but I did bring slides later. So if you have any questions about the techniques or the results later, we can always talk about it. And to characterize the caregiving like involvement, we did some factor analysis, which gave us a two-factor solutions across 5 different measures of caregiving. So one dimension represented affective and behavior support, measured by items such as I hold or touch my grandchildren in an affectionate way, and how much do you love your grandchildren, something like that. And for this instrumental and financial support, that dimension was measured by items such as, okay, how much time do you actually spend weekly with your grandchildren? How much annual income you invest you direct to your grandchildren, or how much basically daily caregiving tests, like bringing children to the hospital, you are currently serving. So you see that there is some division between more effective components of it and more more involved form of engagement, sort of clearly differentiated. All right, so let's see how these results connected together. So our first hypothesis was viewing photos of OGC would increase both signals in the parent-unborn communication circuit, and at least qualitatively we obtained something similar to that, consistent with that prediction. So with the OGC activation higher than any other social categories or non-social categories, although the direct comparison between OGC and FP tend to didn't reach the significant, but the pattern itself is consistent with what I imagined before. But really interestingly, whether this activation directly explained any variance in caregiving engagement, both form of caregiving engagement, didn't find any so parent activation didn't results. I didn't have any predictive comes to individual differences. Did the things look differently when we look into the multivariate pattern? So let me first show you this hierarchical clustering method, the results. You see that grandmother does, where's my cursor? Yeah, the OGC, the representation of the OGC is quite distinct from other social category. And by the way, this organization structure emerged again and again, even though I changed my clustering method and some thresholds. And the only category that is more distinct than OGC as compared to other social categories was non-social object. And you see that UGC and UP, which is unknown grandchildren and unknown parents, are grouped together closely. So they kind of lump together. Familiar parents are kind of sort of distinct, but it's still kind of closely represented with unknown individuals than it was to with OGC, which I found was really, really interesting. This is just another representation of how distinct, how far away the OGC is represented in two-dimensional space. And we did also calculate something called the average pairwise dissimilarity. It looks really complex expressed in this way, but what we just did is that we calculated the average of this dissimilarity value. So from one social category with other social category together. So it gives us a general indices of, okay, on average, how much one social category differ from other ones. And we plotted them, and it looks like the pattern was, again, supports our prediction that OGC tends to have most distinct neurorepresentation compared to all other social category, except for OBJ object, which is the highly distinct. All right, so remember that the univariate activation or average bold amplitude was not associated with the caregiving. Individual differences in caregiving. Did multivariate neurosignature of OGC differ or was successfully predicted individual differences in caregiving? And we found the evidence supporting for that, especially the more the neural distinctiveness of own grandchildren, which is the higher value, is positively associated specifically with affective and behavior support domain, but not necessarily instrumental and financial support. So there is some selective association going on. And we've broken this down to paternal versus maternal grandmother. We did this for mostly a theoretical reason that I can talk about it later, but I think that the data itself is really interesting too. So that correlation, which is this black dots, were entirely driven by the association observed on paternal grandmothers. Of course, it was like 19 individuals, so it's not really like believable, or I don't know how much robust this findings would be, and when tested in a different sample. But this observation was really striking to get into this later. All right, so let's get some recap. As for the first hypothesis, hypothesis one was generally supported in that viewing photos of OGC correlated with higher bold amplitude within the parental motivation circuit, and also it tends to incur more distinct multivoxel neural pattern within the same circuitry. So it generally supports our intuition that maybe in the grandmaternal brain, the information about the grandchildren is somehow it's kind of different from other social categories. Maybe that it's higher rewarding salient, something like that. But the results associated with this hypothesis too is a little nuanced. So let's do it one by one. So the distinct multivoxel neural signature of OGC, but not the average amplitude, correlated or predicted individual differences in caregiving engagement, but it wasn't also that the global caregiving engagement, but was specifically about the affection and behavior support dimension of the caregiving. So what could that be? And I think that the first result is consistent with the general pattern in a neuroscience finding where using multivoxel activation usually could potentially reveal the unique information that's hidden, that's not sensitively detected when you lump the entire activation together. So a lot of studies have shown that using this multivariate technique can actually reveal something that's like unique information that's not detected by average univariate method that focuses on average activation, and thus it may actually serve as a better indicator for individual differences in behavior. So I think that it kind of speaks to that overall pattern in the literature. And as for the selective association between multivoxel patterns of OGC and the affective and supportive behavior domain of caregiving, it may be that instrumental financial support, when you think about it, it's not really enough to have some loving minds, right? Plan, you have to commit, you have to travel to that location, you have to like juggle between your own time and you have to budget correctly. And a lot of this process is not about how much you love your kids, but whether you actually have resources, whether you have time, and whether you have are you physically fit to actually bring yourself and kids into the hospital, something like that. So it's contingent on a lot of more external factors or contextual factor, which might have reduced the total variance explained by the neural activation of the motivating circuit. No, that would be my interpretation of this null finding. And this also, but still, the observed relationship between the multivoxel activation of the OGC and the affective and supportive behavior domain and caregiving still begs the question of the directionality. Of course, this is a cross-sectional data, so I can't tell them for sure, but we can still think about it. So there are two possibilities here. So one is it's experiment dependent. So more caregiving kind of renders the neural representation of OGC more distinct. That's one possibility. And there's another possibility where the directionality is kind of the opposite. So those who are able to form more distinct representation of OGC engages in more caregiving behavior. So like I said, this is not a longitudinal study, so we can't determine the causality simply out of this cross-sectional observation. But based on this data, I think it tells us something about it. So what stands out, this is not just about selective, not just the fact that paternal grandmothers like drove this pattern, but when you look into this white dots, those are maternal grandmothers and their levels of engagement, they're all up here. So when we actually do a regression analysis, there is a main effect of the grandmaternal lineage showing that on average, maternal grandmothers engage much more in caregiving behavior, which is, by the way, quite consistent with like a global pattern. Wherever you go, it is generally the maternal grandmother who come in part to the caregiving behavior, and that's replicated in our study. So if we if the more caregiving experience renders the more distinct neurorepresentation of OGC, we could expect that maybe the multiple patterns in this parental motivation circuit is for grandchildren is more distinct in maternal grandmothers as opposed to the paternal grandmothers. So we tested it a possibility, but it wasn't significant. So they were equally distinct, regardless of the premature lineage and regardless of their average levels of involvement. So that leaves the another possibility where the more distinct neurorepresentation means something that predicts the more caregiving engagement. So we're tentatively kind of calling that as maybe it reflects something like a motivational preparedness or readiness for caregiving. And in this interpretation also helps us interpret why the association between the OGC, neural distinctiveness of OGC was stronger with the caregiving was stronger in paternal grandmothers. So in maternal grandmothers, they often face a stronger social norm for caregiving engagement. And it's been repeatedly shown in both empirical and anthropometric work. And it is possible that regardless of your internal motivation to be involve yourself into caregiving, you're already doing a lot. So when you actually try to learn the correlation analysis, there is no relationship. But it may be that among paternal grandmothers who are less subscribed to, less subjected to this cultural prescription of caregiving engagement, it may be that they're at the degree to which they involve themselves into caregiving may be explained more, maybe like more direct translation by their internal motivation to commit themselves in caregiving. It's a possibility. All right, so take-home points. Grandchildren tend to evoke the strongest and the most unique activation pattern in the paternal motivation circuits in grandmothers. And this uniqueness may reflect individual differences in the motivation for caregiving involvement, and the degree to which this brain activation translates to the actual behavior may be modulated by social norms and cultural context that leads to caregiving something. All right, and I do know that this is full of limitations. This study has a lot of limitations. It's a preliminary data. So for one, it's really, really important that to acknowledge that our sample still is reasonably diverse, but it's very small, and caregiving norm varies a lot across country, across culture, and even within the society. So when you look into different ethnic groups, different cultural groups, they tend to have different norms of engagement. So it is absolutely important that we involve more people to studies like this to actually test the robustness of the finding. And of course, whenever I do this talk, people come and ask, what about grandfathers? No, but it'd be really, really interesting. But of course, there's a reason why we didn't talk about grandfathers, because in some study, the existence grandfathers tend to sometimes get health and they don't so their grandchildren, which is very sad. We'll get to that one there. As for the design, bringing some longitudinal component would be really nice to determine what's really the nature of this distinct representation you see. And that also leads to how do we interpret this? We know that, okay, now we have shown that there's a increased neural distinctiveness associated with OGC, but we don't know exactly. We speculate that it may be it's reflected in the motivational significance of caregiving because we're focusing on VTA, substantia nigra, which we know that is related to caregiving motivation, but that needs more external validity testing. So it's just a speculation for now. If we can somehow identify some psychological variables that are going to track the individual's parenting motivation, and if that correlates well with this brain activation, confidently say that it's actually something related to that. For now, it remains speculative. All right, so this work was something that I did when I was grad student at Emory University. Just briefly acknowledge my funders. And I know that due to the time constraint, we have to wait till the end for the questions. And sorry, is that okay? So I'm going to jump right into the next question, which concerns more about not the mechanism itself, but like how does engaging in grandmaternal caregiving, how does engaging in caregiving affects your health, not just the health of the care recipient. So we already covered and established that grandmaternal caregiving enhances grandchildren's health and survival. This is the nature study that I talked about earlier in this slide. And I also mentioned that there are a couple of other species, non-human species that that has grandmothers, and data actually show that non-human grandmothers also like enhance their grandchildren's survivability, which is awesome. I think grandmothers are just really like, amazing. But anyway, so we established this one. But what about like what is it in for grandmothers? Is there any like direct benefits other than like, oh, you help someone who carry your gene to survive better? And the reason why I ask this question is because we know that there's emerging evidence suggesting that the caregiving is not all about the burden and stress. So as many of you already are familiar with this idea, that when we think about caregiving, we tend to think about, oh, it's really stressful, it's costly, it incurs like a psychological cost and physiological cost. But evidence, when you actually sum a lot of evidence together, the pattern is not as straightforward, and actually it tends to points to another direction where the caregiving status, caregiving experiences can actually enhance the health of the caregiver, not just hindering them. And it also, my question was also motivated by another independent line of evidence showing that in parents, if you have more kids, if you interact with them, your cognitive and motor function tend to became better over time. And also in brain, we can look into the brain structure, such as the limbic system, basal ganglia, where your motor coordination, social mobility are kind of housed in. Mothers with higher numbers of birth show more delayed or like a less age-related structural alteration with this region. So this kind of evidence points to the possibility that similar pattern may also exist in grandmothers. So I went back to our samples again, tried to reanalyze our data based on this premises that maybe grandmaternal caregiving engagement are rendering their brain healthier than those who are not engaging in grandmaternal caregiving daily. So remember we sampled. Okay, so it's actually the other one. So get to the part. So we collected another groups of mothers, age-matched mothers who are all mothers but not grandmothers, and we collected a lot of like demographic information and lifestyle factors like this. It was really, really difficult to really tightly control the demographic variables during the recruitment stage, so we decided to collect all of them and try to statistically correct for them. So this is the result. I kind of acknowledge that the N is it's very smaller side, but I think that's still kind of interesting pattern. And we did something called a brain age estimation. I'm sure that you are familiar with this technique. It's a machine learning based approach where we train on a normative model using a big data that contains okay, this is chronological age, and this is a structural characteristic that are typically associated with a particular age associated with a particular age. And once the train is over, we feed the algorithm with a new data. In our case, it was a structural data sample from grandmothers and also a control group, and ask the model to determine and calculate, oh, based on this structural characteristic, how old this person do you think is going to be? And we compare the predicted age with the participant's chronological age. And if the resulting value is negative, that means that your brain looks younger than your actual chronological age. And if the resulting value is positive, that means that your brain looks older than how it should look like for your age. And we compared grandmothers' brain aged with the control group members, and after controlling for the demographic differences and lifestyle differences that were significantly different between two groups of participants, and we found that their maternal status was negatively with or associated with lower brain age, and the effect size is mind-blowing. Of course, I don't believe this because it can be exaggerated, but the pattern itself is really interesting. So the caregiving status is actually associated with lower brain age. So since we are not confident about this result, we actually tried to solve the internal replication attempt using the similar pattern, trying to look for the similar pattern in different groups of caregiver. It was really important. So keep practicing caregiving in a completely different context outside parenting itself. So there we look into the caregivers for people living with dementia. We all know that the dementia is on the rise globally in the US as well. And the dementia caregivers typically report a lot of stress and burden, and they tend to show negative health results. So it may be, if we can show that the brain age, the same pattern exists with them, I think that it can tell us a lot about, okay, actually caregiving is not just about all bad things, but it can also actually help yourself by doing it. I think that's really meaningful. So we did that. So we had two groups of caregivers, individuals, dementia caregiver and age-matched control group who are really like not engaging in any caregiving activity. And we did a similar analysis in a similar approach, comparing their brain age. And here again, we found that the caregiving state was again associated with age. Again, the caveat here is that it's a really small sample size. We're even talking about a sample size smaller than 100, and it's not ideal. But I think that similar pattern arose in two different qualitative different groups of caregiving may mean that there is some mechanistic process that actually links these results together across different contexts. So my final talk will concern this particular mechanistic aspects of it. So if there is a link between caregiving engagement and lower brain age, mostly in terms of structural function, what would that be? What would be the mediating mechanism? Or what would be mechanisms that could potentially link these factors together? And of course, it's not a single mechanism, I know, but I think that we can start with focusing on one very important candidate mechanism that I think is really playing a role, which is oxytocin. So oxytocin is a neuropeptide. It's a nonapeptide, mostly synthesized in mammalian hypothalamus, especially supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus, and it's served as both neuromodulator. So it binds to other brain regions, but it also circulates to the system. And we typically study the functions of oxytocin in the angle of a love hormone, but it's much more than that. We have few decades of research has established that oxytocin is not just a love hormone; it does a lot of complex social functions as well. But in this context, when oxytocin actually binds to the receptor, it's been highly implicated in increased caregiving behavior in maternal context, paternal context, and also parental behavior as well. So it is a really good candidate mechanism. And what exactly, what aspect, what property of the oxytocin can potentially make your brain healthier, and why is it relevant in the context of caregiving? So when you think about what caregiving entails, it may involve a physical touch, affectionate touch, especially when you're taking care for your family members. It could be that you make an eye contact and you're to have a conversation, and you keep meeting familiar individuals that you may have positive emotion associated with. And these are all very potent enhancer of endogenous oxytocin signaling. It actually boosts the oxytocin synthesis and secretion to the both brain and the blood. And we do know from animal and some preliminary human evidence that oxytocin has a lot of neuroprotective effects at different levels. So we have rodents evidence showing that oxytocin actually reverses the negative effects of stress on telomere length. So it increases the longevity. And it actually has a lot of anti-apoptotic and anti-inflammatory and anti-oxidative properties. So it actually has a really strong preventive effects on cellular function when the system is under stress. And this is especially a lot of evidence is coming from some temporal lobe, hippocampus, and some other temporal lobe region. So directly suggesting that oxytocin kind of buffers against the negative effects of these factors. And the circle level, it downregulates the HPA axis, thereby like kind of silencing the potentially negative effects of the stress hormone and chronic activation of the HPA axis. And lastly, at the highest level, the psychological behavior level, if you have increased oxytocin signaling internally, then it actually increases your affiliated motivation to the target or the other social individual. So there may be thereby potentially leading to more social interaction, more of those initial enhancer that activated the oxytocin system. So there might be some sort of positive feedback loop going on here. And I think that this makes the oxytocin as a really, really interesting potential mechanism that can link the observed link between caregiving engagement and brain age. So we want to test this, not just the idea, but we want to test this in some way. So if this relationship exists, I think there would be 3 predictions that can derive from this. One is if the oxytocin will, so we have a grandmother sample and we did collect saliva samples from them. So since this is about the grandmother, I talk a little bit about samples. So prediction 1 is that oxytocin system will be unregulated on grandmothers as opposed to non-grandmother, which is less involved daily or weekly. And the second prediction is that this increased oxytocin signaling will positively correlate with affiliated motivation or actual caregiving engagement. And this increased caregiving engagement will be negatively associated with estimated brain. To try to test this prediction, focusing on a measure of endogenous oxytocin signaling. Especially we focus on the methylation of the oxytocin receptor gene. So methylation is one first mechanism of epigenetic regulation of gene controls. The methyl group binds to the CPG thereby suppressing the gene expression. And when it comes to the oxytocin function, the oxytocin molecule should bind to the receptor in order to have its co-function. And when oxytocin gene is like expression is silenced or is suppressed, then you have a less of receptor availability, which can limit the degree to which the oxytocin molecules can actually translate into functions. Okay? And higher methylation is typically associated with increased suppression. So in this case, higher methylation is indicative of low endogenous oxytocin signaling. Is this clear? Okay, so we sampled this and we tested whether across the oxytocin gene, which is on the chromosome 3, is there any evidence that grandmothers are actually show lower methylation, meaning higher endogenous oxytocin signaling in the body? And we actually found supporting evidence in every single site that we identified. It's mind-blowing. It's every single point, every single CPG island that we targeted. There wasn't no single point where grandmothers actually showed higher methylation than control. It was really, really interesting. So across all these regions, grandmothers showed lower methylation levels compared to the control group. So it's kind of consistent with our the first prediction. And did the oxytocin actually methylation level related to the caregiving behavior? Again, little underpowered, but the pattern is consistent with this model where lower oxytocin level increases the positive effect towards grandchildren, which reinforces the caregiving engagement. So the second mechanistic pathway is there. And lastly, the same model, but if we incorporate the brain age to the path analysis, we know that we show that the grandmaternal caregiving engagement is actually negatively predictive of age. So again, this is highly speculative and we're projecting a little bit because we're talking about like 50 grandmothers. So we're underpowered to actually test the real effect. But knowing that this could be an existing pattern, I think allows us to do so much more thing. So all the pathway that we tested, we've postulated from the predictions were supported. And let me also give the take-home points here. So brain age overall was negatively associated with the caregiving status. And in grandmothers, increased oxytocin signaling, endogenous oxytocin signaling were associated with positive effects towards grandchildren and caregiving engagement. And this was in turn predicted brain age. So caregiving may benefit caregivers via enhanced brain health, and also increased OT signaling may be a key mechanism that links all these puzzle pieces together. All right, so I think I have 1 minute, so I'm gonna talk about like potential. Well, we can talk about this, but I want to talk about future direction, because I think it's more interesting. So this model like actually tells us, like allows us to like potentially test, okay, how do we show in a more strong way that this pathway exists? It's like, according to our conceptual and this path model mechanistic pathway, one thing that we can do to maximize the benefits of caregiving is we create either individualized intervention or social context that boosts the oxytocin, endogenous oxytocin signaling. So this, my current work and some of the future work that I'm currently working on for a grant proposal actually focuses on some sort of the impact of supportive social context in both grandmothers and dementia caregiver, and try to link that to the oxytocin measure, their reported health outcomes. So we can think about that, okay, maybe we can create a really supportive environment where we know for sure that it boosts the oxytocin signaling, and this may have some downstream effects over time. So that's like stage. And I'd like to conclude my talk by quoting Dave Bowie. Dave Bowie is a lot of things, but I really like this quote. So aging is an extraordinary process where you became the person you always should have been. I think that this has a really good rings to it, because when we think about aging or late adulthood in general, a lot of focus in cognitive science has been focused on preventing illness, preventing disease. Let's not get sick. Let's like find some risk factor and tackle them down. Let's have some protective. I'll try to protect ourselves from negative effects of aging. But I think that this highlights really like there is some yet another domain that has received relatively less attention from neuroscientists and cognitive science or development sciences in general, so that the late adulthood and aging don't have to be all about pathological condition, but there might be some dimensions of sociality that are uniquely present in humans in late adulthood, such as the grandmaternal caregiving, and studying what is under supporting that grandmaternal caregiving and what are the beneficial effects of engaging in that wonderful experiences, what you can get from it. I think it's like one next chapter that the neuroscience should focus a little. Of course, fighting the disease is absolutely important, but I just wanted to close my talk with like just shared notion that it may be not the entire picture. We can do something like that. Thank you for your attention, and
We will take questions.
Do you mind going back to the slide of your mediation model, the
Yes.
one where you had the two mediators specifically?
this one.
Yes. I had a quick question on this. So it looks like there is a positive, when you go from methylation to positive affect towards grandchildren, that's significant. I noticed that the path from methylation to maternal caregiving engagement was not significant. So this is only if they have a positive affect towards their grandchildren, correct? So I guess my question would be, looking at grandparents who have this positive affect towards children versus a no affect or negative affect towards grandchildren,
Yes.
and how do you think this would play? I guess my first question is, how do you think that would play out?
It is absolutely amazing question, and we actually wanted to test the possibility, but one limitation of this data was that we had so little variation in like how a lot of grandmothers actually reported almost like maximum levels of like positive affect towards children. So it was kind of a sample the variation that may necessarily maybe that we need to tap into the possibility, and it remains to be like an important testing point that it's kind of outstanding. Something
my grandmother your way.
some I do know, and that speaks to the importance of like sampling from more diverse, not just like demographically, but also psychologically diverse populations. We do know that not all grandmothers are equally invested. So that's a great question.
And then I do have one follow-up question.
Yes.
So in the first study that you looked at, I'm curious if you took note of whether the grandparent was the sole grandparent. So for instance, like if both the maternal and paternal grandparents are living, I'm like, if I was a maternal grandmother, I might say, oh, well, the maternal grandmother might take care of it versus if I'm the only grandparent, or if my child is the sole provider for that, for my grandchild, how would that influence my likelihood to participate either in financial or emotional benefit?
That's a good. And could you also? I don't want to misinterpret your question. So would you be able to repeat that just one?
Yeah. So my question is, did you record and or analyze data that looked at whether the grandparent was the sole living grandparent in your first study? So if only the paternal grandparent was alive, like that was the only person participating in the study? And did you look at if they had both grandparents alive?
A lot of them were. I think there were like 2% were like sole grandparents.
Okay.
So, yeah. So we couldn't really empirically test that, but that's a really interesting possibility that there are some situational constraints that can actually prevent them from, or they can significantly change the way that they engage in grandparent itself. We didn't have that much of variability in our data. Excellent question. Thank you.
Yeah, so it sounds like thesis of the first piece of the talk was centered around the question of why does, in this case, the grandparent in the social cultural context where the grandparent is supported to engage with their offspring's offspring, why do or how do they feel about their offspring's offspring? Is it the same circuits or not? And it looked like that was the imaging goal, and it seems like maybe yes is sort of the answer. And if that is, do you feel like that piece of the story is sort of closed, or is there more kinds of permutations of that approach that you would want to do to really suss out? Is this specific to grandmother, or is this specific to grandmothers at certain ages, grandmothers' absence of certain diseases that come with age, and so forth?
Yeah. So one thing, it's just it's far from being closed. So it's just the first piece of it. And like I said, there are so many dimensions of grandmaternal types of grandmaternal care that are more specific circumstances where in which different grandparents like provide care. We did a sample. So it is like there are so many more questions that end up we haven't answered than the one that we answered. This is just like a very first piece of it. One thing that I'm really interested in doing is to try to replicate this in, of course, in a larger sample, but also culturally diverse like context. I was once asked if like from Paul Wagger, he asked me like, okay, if you have like infinite amount of money, like what did you do? Then I want to build an MRI center in a traditional society that sample all of those people. Because like one thing that really like we can do something really interesting is that in westernized, more industrialized and Western society, like there are not so much variation in terms of the family structure. But when you actually like widen our research range and look into the other society outside more industrialized context, we have a much more variation in caregiving form. And there could be also like more paternal centered like society as well. So sampling those variation could be really, really interesting next goal, which is very difficult to achieve, but we can do it. We can start with a more modest cross-cultural study where we have different social norms exist or how tight those the caregiving is enforced in, let's say, and from South Korea. So it could be South Korea versus like North American family, and like big family versus like a small nuclear family, that kind of situation. So there are so many questions that we end up not responding that are directly answering. I'm glad that you asked it.
Yeah, so I did read your paper like this one, and I know you guys looked at custodial grandparent caregiving as well, even though the samples are really small. I was wondering if you think that there would be a protective effect for custodial grandparents, even though they're basically acting as
Great question.
that parent versus grandparents.
So I'm assuming that you were talking about the brain age results.
Yes.
So one interesting finding that I kind of glossed over from this model was that, all right, yeah, from this model is that stress is positively associated with brain aging, regardless of the. So custodial grandparents are usually more stressed. They are much more under like heavier burden. So I think that while the pattern may exist, because in this model the brain effect, the effective caregiving status remains significant after controlling the stress differences, it may still be there. But I would assume if I have to make a prediction, the protective effects may be a little mitigated. That would be my prediction. But of course, that remains to be a question.
A really interesting way to kind of think completely from a different dimension about life, right? And a couple of questions for the brain age. We don't really know what it measures, right? So could it be something related with both of the caregiver and the grandma and the maternal grandmother care, a more active lifestyle compared to maybe counterparts of the same age? That is for the second part. I wonder what you thought. For the first part, it was striking to me that there was something more in terms of distinctiveness for the grandchild than the child.
Yes.
And to me, like one of the things it could reflect, the grandchild, it just is a child, has been a child, right? In terms of what you get out of just a still's picture of the face is, in a way, maybe not capturing the breadth of experiences with this child, with this person, right? Otherwise, it's kind of interesting. You know, there's so many ways by which you can think of why is your own child has different distinctiveness or something different. And in terms of the methods, you may have talked about in that same study, you only showed us male. So I wonder if it was like males, female, and how those crossover might actually play into some of those findings as well.
So let me first answer your second question. So I think that I can answer it in two different ways. What exactly brain age person measures? It's a combination of multiple different things. And like it could be different cortical measures, the structural measures of like structural characteristic. Density can be the parameter volume. The particular method that we used started off like used the brain VBM value as an input file, but it also there are some other information that tell us exactly what it is. And there are some ways to kind of backtrack this brain age estimation to tell which aspects of, let's say, different aspects of structural brain. It could be white matter, it could be gray matter, it could be localized effects, it could be gray matter specifically to a certain brain part is driving the effect, which we didn't do in our data. So speaking of like what exactly having lower or higher brain age potentially refers to in terms of the structural characteristic, there are some more resolution that we could pursue. That's one thing. And you talked about other lifestyle differences that may drive this effect. And I can tell you that from our model, we tried to control for some other non-caregiving related lifestyle factors such as exercise that can potentially affect the brain age differences. We try to control for those effects. So in at least our model, of course, there are so many variables that we didn't sample for a logistical reason. But I can say that among the predictors that we included in our, there are some other tried to control for those variables as well. And as for the first question, I think that it was also a two-part question. One is, I remember the second part, which is about the sex effect. In the end, the second, what was the first one?
First one was about the child versus brain.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I don't have a good answer to that. And it's kind of funny to think that the neurorepresentation of FP, familiar parents, was somewhere in the middle between OGC and this. So, and when we did an interview, some grandmothers, they do report that I've seen enough of my children. So which is quite funny. And like this, grandchildren are not like, they're totally new. They're so cute, and it's kind of leaving all the positive memory. But for my kids, I love them, but you know. And we actually published like more in 2021, another preliminary study, a study directly comparing the neurocorrelates of OGC versus FP. And there we found that OGC is more, perceiving photos of OGC was more associated with brain region implicated in emotional empathy and or let's say reward processing region, whereas seeing the photos of adult child was a little more cognitive. So their activation was a little more associated with, let's say, the brain that are more typically associated with, let's say, theory of mind, mentalizing type of stuff. So there might be some different mental set that grandmother are using to approach. And it may play out in this particular study. And with regard to your question about like not sampling the whole dimensions of, let's say, the your children-related experiences, what we can do for our next studies, then we can potentially include the photo of like your family or parent when they were young. And we can also think about the photo of oneself being really young, so that we can more parcel out exactly what this unique representation actually shows. Yes.
Kind of along those lines, I have a question. Do you think that's more of a like parent versus grandparent dichotomy, or do you think that those activations might be because they've had more time with their child? So for instance, their child is clearly of childbearing age, let's say let's say
Yes.
5 years and up, whereas this grandchild, depending on the age of the grandchild, very new, might only have a couple of years of experience with it.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if it's like a parent versus grandparent thing, or is it a familiarity and how many years of experience had with that individual?
That's a wonderful question. And although we didn't sample exactly that, but we did try to explore the possibility by including children's age, adult children's age, focal child age, and also the grandchildren age, and also the years since they first become grandmothers. Tried to control for that and try to see whether our model still holds up, which I didn't introduce today, but every pattern remained the same. So I think that distinctiveness itself is not really experience dependent, or maybe not fully explained. Let's put it this way: not fully explained by just how long this person has been grandmother for that child, or how long you have known your own familiar parents.
Yeah.
Great question, though.
I have another follow-up question on this. So I was wondering whether you have done any direct analysis to compare what's the difference between the representation of the grandparents or grandmother, or like their direct parents or direct mother. Because yeah, and whether there's any difference, because for the grandmother there will be like just like two distances away from the grandchild. Could be like the parent, the mother, grandmother, and what's the difference?
So just so that I understand your question correctly, have I compared the representation of own grandchildren with familiar parent, or is it more like, did I also compare the representation of OGC from parents?
It's the second
one. Yeah, we didn't, which is really sad. We wanted, but there are many constraints. Yes. And this study was actually done in COVID as well, so which is a significant logistical challenge.
If there's any result.
But I really do want to do that. One thing that we didn't, and this analysis itself was not, this test design was not optimized for really parsing out the granularity of the data. This was actually designed for asking more basic question. Okay, what are brain regions are activated? See the photos of your grandchildren, because that data didn't exist between 2021 and our paper was out in today. And we tried to do a little more on that. So we kind of reused the same data, tried to see side to individual differences. But if I have to, let's say, redesign this task, do something differently, I would absolutely sample more diverse like stimulus set and what you're getting at too is also like generate the genetic distance from self. We can more directly sample that by including not just the like what we used in the study. We can do the relative. We can do oneself. We can also include the photos of oneself, which I really wish that we had in this study. We didn't have it, so we can directly model genetic distance from self from all for all these different social groups. Great question. Thank you.
Actually just started to get at what I was going to ask, which was, yeah, in all I've read about altruism, it's all about genetic distance. Maybe it's outdated because I've been they're taking that approach, but it seemed like your first result kind of combated that with this idea between the maternal and paternal grandparents. There's kind of this cultural aspect that supersedes the, genetic distance is equal, but there's this cultural thing that strains that's there. And then within that, there's also, individual differences just based on whatever input factors there are. So kind of just broadly for personally, between those three, genetic, cultural, and broad individual differences, are there any relationships that you're just really excited about?
Oh, I am so excited about something called gene culture coefficient. That's another research domain that that's another lines of research that we're doing. So you ask the genetic levels and cultural level difference as a separate levels, but they are actually more integrated to create a variation of sociology. So we can talk about it more in depth. It's a really fascinating. But one thing that I wanted to just add in quickly is the reason why we compared paternal versus maternal grandparents. You said that the genetic distance are the same. You could say that, but there's also an evolutionary scientist who said that, okay, but you really don't know if this is your kid. There's something called paternal uncertainty. And a lot of people try to explain that fathers or a paternal grandmother's use involvement in caregiving is consistent with the idea that, maybe this paternal grandmothers are maybe not consciously, but somehow behaving in such that their levels of pro-social engagement scales with this genetic uncertainty of their kids. So I just wanted to point out that dimension, which I think is really interesting, but kind of difficult to navigate. Yes.
Is there any question on Teams?
No, there's no questions on Teams.
Okay, thank you so much for Dr. Lee for a fantastic talk and all of you to be part of it.
Thank you so much.